Stole someone's.
Okay.
This guy right here, Harold. Our first ever.
How are things going? I kind of just wanted to check in on people's process with analyzing harmony, getting started with that. Does anyone have any questions? So starting on Monday, we are going to be actually spending in class time, trying to do some play testing, gathering some data. So have a first pass at something that is balanced. My recommendation, since this isn't fully done yet, maybe edit the cards and the decks that you made. And if you make changes to the costs of something or something does, just cross them out, write something else there, and that will become your pass number 2, and you'll gather some data on that. Then you can go take that, go back, make some further changes, and eventually finalize your idea. Let's say something like, let's finalize our ideas by something like Wednesday. I'm coming to the conclusion that I think I want to spend most to all of next week just getting playtest data and spending that time in class working on this, because I think this is a big enough ask. There's a lot involved in not just writing the paper, but gathering all the data you need to write the paper. So I want to spend some time, allow for some back and forth between the experience that you get with that. And I want to make sure that you're taking away something that easily translates into written arguments. So we'll kind of play next week by ear a little bit, but I anticipate just the default being, let's spend the time gathering some data and preparing to write. And when people seem like, I'm ready to write, I don't have any more to collect, then we can consider going back and doing something else. But I'll wait until we kind of get a consensus on that. And other than that, there should be lots that we can do with that in class time with regards to actually play testing with each other. Questions or concerns about that?
So is the exam next week?
Yeah, exam is on Friday.
It would be pretty short then.
I do not know because I haven't written it. I haven't even written the study guide. It has to fit in that 1 hour period.
We're supposed to get a study guide today.
It's not Friday.
Oh.
As much as I want it to be Friday. If you can make it Friday, I'll get you a study guide. Thinking. How can I do this?
That's too much effort.
I want it to be Friday as much as
Wait,
you
can I adjust the date on my computer?
Could be able to. Somehow.
Adjust date and time. Yes, I can. I can make it Friday.
Okay, so this should be I'm kind of deciding that this is going to be the last unit that we're going to cover this quarter. We will dive back into this next quarter and tackle things from a little bit different angle. So next quarter, for those of you who will be taking this next quarter, I think that is a reasonable chunk of who's actually here today. I took a look at that class list and it looked like we're losing quite a few people, but most of the people I'm seeing here are taking part too. But we'll dive into and start talking about learning agents, how to make game AI. I think that's a really important topic to cover that we haven't really touched on. There's a lot of material that I can present on that. And then I've also received at least a couple of requests from people about the kinds of content that they would like to see covered. So one request was for worlds and world building. If people want to cover something else like that, just send me an email. I don't have all of that material made or prepared, but if people are really interested in some aspect of game design and development, shoot me an email. I'll try to at least make some kind of short unit on it. If not, if I can find something as a deeper dive than that, we won't have a ton of time. So for those of you who you probably all know because you registered for it, but it's going to be twice a week, 2.5 hours, which is a lot, but one of those two, at least one of those two every week is going to be in-class lab time to work on the games that you are making. The other will be some kind of either long lecture with a break or kind of the special topics. So we'll start with game AI, and then as there is time at the end of that, we can dive into any other.
For the next part, are we choosing our groups or
Yes.
you choosing?
So you will be choosing both of the groups you work with, but you cannot have any member in common between those two groups.
All right.
There are reasons for that.
And how many people per group?
3 people per group.
All right.
So yes, you may choose your groups,
Similar to my senior project.
but what I'm going to state is that for project number 2, the graduate students need to work together and the undergraduates need to work together. So what that means is that for game number 1, no graduate can work together. You'll all have to pick some undergraduates to work with for game number 1. And game number 2 will have some different requirements based on whether it is a graduate game or an undergraduate game. And that will be the difference in that course. All right. So we're going to dive into and talk a little bit about combat and combat design, because that is a feature of many, many, many games out there. I don't necessarily want to say most, I don't want to say almost all, because I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's a staple as a part of games and game design. How do you design for combat? So let's start with, that's a very small text. In one sentence, describe the best combat experience you've ever had in a video game. What was that like? And see if you can abstract it to talking about it in a single sentence. Take some time to think about that.
Combat experience didn't work. There are too many to. This is the best.
Yeah.
Are you looking for like feedback or just for us to think about it?
Eventually we will share. So yeah, if you start to have some ideas of a sentence to describe the best combat that you've experienced, go ahead and raise your hand and we can start talking about it. Yeah.
I don't know, it brings to mind like a combat that like gets your heart racing, that's, you know, gets you like, gives anxiety or almost anxiety, or like you just like, feel on edge, on the edge of your seat, like your heart's about to
Yes.
explode.
Okay, so you feel like there is some danger, there are some stakes. Maybe there's some counterplay of, I know that I am capable of doing something, but I also feel vulnerable. Like things can go poorly very quickly, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Challenging, fair, and then fighting.
vague, and
Okay, let's
So,
get each
yeah.
fair.
what does that look like? What is challenging? Explain what you mean there.
The boss was not easy, but wasn't so unbalanced that I felt like I'm getting smacked into the dirt. It felt like almost a mirror match. You know, to the point where it could be a toss up and one little thing could make the difference between winning or losing.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, okay. So now you're talking about the level of player skill, where the skills the enemy has is not so cheap that you're vulnerable, but it doesn't feel like, we'll get to this in a bit, maybe you want to spoil this, but the concept of if you're going to fail, it's your fault. Basically, it's not the game's fault, it's not the control's fault, it's your fault.
You can tell it is because my controller died halfway through the fight.
I would hate that.
Sure.
But it's your fault for not changing the battery.
They were fresh, they were full when I started it, I moved through the play for
That's-
10 minutes.
That's how intense the boss fight was. The battery just noped out. Any other ideas or thoughts about combat?
Resident Evil 4 has that system where if you're doing well enough, then the game starts making each encounter a little more challenging until you start doing poorly, and then it brings back in. So it always felt like you were doing as well as you could, and that the challenge was not so overwhelming that you could.
Yeah, it respects your skill. The game respects your skill. Yeah, that's very important. Any others? I want to get a reasonable sample size before I reveal the next line, because maybe it'll be a little bit funny. Yeah.
That I've better things express my mastery of mechanics.
Yeah.
if there's enough challenge to feel like there's obviously danger here, but I'm able to, yeah, keep up with it, feel like I'm powerful and successful. Because of what I've learned over.
Yeah, because you start to take pride in your skill because the game rewards you for the learning that you've done by making you feel badass. Yeah,
Like, I personally don't care about difficulty too much, so much as like the feel of a game. So like, if I'm capable of doing the things that like in my mind I picture doing, and they are not necessarily like easy to pull off, but like I am capable of pulling off what I am picturing. That's what matters to me. It's very much
Yeah.
play.
the game's systems support what you want to be able to do with the game systems. It's not limiting you on what you can do because of the restrictions of the system. That's kind of fourth wall breaking. Okay, lots of good ideas. How many people mentioned spreadsheet? How many people mentioned algorithm? How many people mentioned math? There's a level of abstraction between what the player is actually interacting with and what the designer has put into the experience. So the player is certainly not thinking about what the designer had to think about when going and doing this. So we're going to abstract from the math and the code that we have been talking about to talk about, okay, what is the link between this player's experience and because this is what the designer has to interact with to be able to create that situation. So we need to be able to understand what that mapping looks like. How do you create that feeling in the player through what you actually have control of? You can think of combat kind of like a drama that unfolds in front of you as you're playing the game. So in the heat of battle, people are not thinking about the game's balance. They're not thinking about values in a spreadsheet or math. They're thinking about the controls, placement.
Playing World of Warcraft.
Yes. So let's talk about how combat should feel. And you get a sense of this just from the answers to these questions. You can tell when combat is well designed just by how players talk about that combat or how you feel when you're engaging with that combat. It's more of an emotional reaction than it is to a logical understanding of the game's mechanics. So if you put enough thought into this, then you can start to create that. But it's not enough to just mathematically solve a game from a designer's perspective, implement that, and then call it good. We're going to see that in this project. No matter how much effort you put into your value functions for all of the cards in Harmony and all the mechanics in Harmony, something is still going to feel off when it comes down to the actual playing of the game. And maybe this is a weakness in your formulaic understanding of the game, or maybe it's just a limitation of it's very difficult to incorporate this particular concept of it feels like my deck is not powerful enough, even if it's mathematically balanced. There's still a feel associated with what it's like to play with a deck of cards. So let's think about if we're designing for the player, what should the player be feeling when they engage with that combat? So empowered, capable of making winning decisions. They shouldn't feel lost or floundering around. They should feel like there is a path to their end goal. They know how to get there, or at least how to move in that direction. And we want to be heroically badass from time to time. So from a design perspective, we want to design the combat loop. We're not going to design the entirety of the game focused on combat. We want to think about, let's dive into some kind of repeatable sequence of actions. So if I swing my sword and then prepare myself for the next swing, what is it like to go through a particular small combat loop or larger combat loop for how to handle a particular situation? So a combat loop is just a short repeatable sequence of actions, and you can break down combat now into windows of time where what is the player doing? How does this act like a coding loop. If you do this really, really, really well, where that 30 seconds feels amazing, then you can make an entire game out of just changing up the environments that you're doing this loop in, changing up the weapon that you have equipped when you do that loop, fighting against some enemies that some of them are flying, some of them are on the ground, some of them have ranged projectiles, some of them come up and try to whack you with a sharp claw. But you vary a few things, and that combat loop by itself can become the entire game. So let's dive into that and figure out how can we make that combat feel fluid in that 30-second window. The first main focus that we should be considering is the camera. Where is it? What's it doing? We've all played games where the camera makes it really easy to do what we want to do, and we've played games where we feel like we're fighting the camera to figure out where are the enemies. When I swing my sword, is it swinging in the direction the camera is focused or the direction my character is focused? If I'm looking at my character from the side and I swing my sword and they start moving off to the side, when I'm looking at the enemy with the camera, that feels counterintuitive. So things to keep in note. Where is the camera looking? How does the camera move with respect to the actions that the player character is capable of doing at that point? From a player's perspective, as a designer, put yourself in the player's shoes and try to figure out, do they have the information that they need to be able to decide, should I be attacking? Should I be defending? Should I be moving? Should I be dodging? Where is that information? When the player is in danger, do they know they are in danger? Are there indicators on the HUD that say you have an enemy close to you? Is it on a mini map in the corner as a small dot? Is it a flash of kind of red from somewhere where you can hear the noise that tells you maybe you should turn to the right and you'll see the enemy that's close to you? What do you want to do with the HUD so the user gets the information they need? Of course, depending on the game genre and game type, the camera will be in a very different position. So third-person games, the camera is usually behind the player character. You can see the player character in front of you. So if there's some kind of lock-on mechanic, instead of having to manually change where the camera is located to move toward an enemy, you can press a lock-on button, which will then look for the enemy that is closest to you and swing the camera so that that enemy is right in front of you. So now you can not worry about manipulating the camera and just worry about attacking, defending, evading, something that is an immediate reaction to the danger, so you're not fighting the camera. So third person is really good for, often you need some kind of lock-on mechanic so that the player is not fighting the camera. First person games where now you're looking from that character's perspective. So you can still have a lock-on mechanic, but it seems a little bit strange to suddenly from that perspective, swing that perspective to be looking somewhere else. So maybe you need to be looking at the enemy and then you can lock on to that enemy. But you can utilize environmental effects. So things like the camera's lens. If you're utilizing some kind of lens effect or blur effects for motion, that starts to feel really realistic if you're going to be doing some fast-paced action from a first-person perspective, as well as any camera shaking that goes on. If maybe you're jumping or you've been knocked off your feet or the ground is moving because horses are galloping around you, that all adds to the realism. But you wouldn't want to feel that from a third-person perspective because you're abstracted from what that person is experiencing from the brain, from the eyes of that person. So first person really likes to utilize camera effects like this. Crosshairs also work really well. You can still use those in third person, but they're especially important in first person shooter type games so that you know where you're actually aiming. Any kind of visual cues, because the camera is very limited in a first person mode, unless you have a very wide ranging camera that looks beyond the peripheral vision of the character that you're in control of. You need some kind of visual cue to know what's going on around you. In third person, you have a wider viewing angle, so you don't need that quite as much. In first person, you really need to know and have a way to know what's going on around you. So all of this is important to think about when designing the camera for combat situations. Of course, the player doesn't want to know that a camera exists. They shouldn't be thinking about the camera while they are playing the game. That's an important part of the design, but you want to abstract that from the player's knowledge and experience to whatever extent you can. Questions on cameras and camera manipulation? You've experienced this in your playing around with Unity, how the camera works, what the camera looks like from different perspectives. So you have some experience with this, and next quarter you will be designing games that utilize that. So try to take these principles into account. A common criticism that I am familiar with from novice games that get made, one of the docking points from students who review those games is that the camera was too obvious. I had to fight with the camera too much. So this is one of those nice elements to focus on to make sure that the player is not as aware of the camera. Sound in combat, also very important. So sound in combat really sets the mood of the combat. If sounds are nice and light, then it doesn't really add a sense of urgency, whereas deep bass, the deep bass of galloping hooves makes it feel like I'm actually in the middle of a battlefield. So sound fills the gap between the actual written code, the art, the player's imagination. It's kind of the middle point of all of that. It's what grounds the player in the world that they are in. So goals with sound design, crisp. They shouldn't feel like they're low quality or muddled. They should feel crisp and high quality. That really it adds to the realism and the immersion of the situation. They should be distinct from each other. When a player hears a sound, they should know exactly what that sound came from and means, especially if that sound is indicating danger or that sound is indicating the presence of an enemy. They should know, is this an enemy that's on foot or an enemy that's on horseback? Those sounds should be distinct from each other. That way you don't need to utilize the camera to figure out what the danger is. You can use the sound and react based solely on the sound. So if you're playing some kind of shooter, the sound that a sniper rifle makes is distinct from the sound that a rocket launcher makes. You know, if a rocket is being fired, you have time to react and to get out of the way, unless it's a heat-seeking rocket. But you hear that rocket fire, and now as a player, you know exactly what you need to do. Where's it coming from? Where's its trajectory? Is it headed toward me? Do I need to move? All of that should be a split-second decision before you swing the camera around because you know that a rocket was fired. Especially anything that represents danger, even if it's the same sound, a sound that means that the player is in danger should be played at a louder volume or higher. Even if it's the same place that a rocket is being fired, if it's being fired at the player rather than being fired over the player's head, if you increase the sound of that rocket, the player will get a bigger sense of urgency from that rocket being fired. And not necessarily be able to tell the difference between the 2 times it was fired, once over their head and once right at them. It gives them a sense that something is happening. So I very much agree with this. We don't give sound enough credit for the immersion that it creates, especially in combat situations. But go play a game that has really poor sound design and you will get that sense. Yeah.
Doesn't this apply to that? I can't remember what game they're developing, but there was a game that every player was like, this gun feels really underpowered, and all they did was change the noise it made, and everyone's like, oh, you fixed it.
Yeah.
That was like an issue that Anthem suffered from when it first came out. The guns were just kind of sounding like plinky. So you're like flying around these giant, like, you're not giant mechs, you're like in these mech suits with like arm rockets and stuff, and it would be like blink, 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 blink. And people were just like, this is stupid. So they changed the sounds. And
I would love to actually make a game. One of them has poor sound design and one of them has good sound design. I really want a first-person shooter that just goes. I've also wanted one that fires cats. Yeah, and the cat is flying past you, is trying. I think that would be really funny to take the bullet dodging scene from The Matrix and replace the bullet with cats. Anyway, this is what I think about in my free time. Other thoughts? Yeah,
I mean, I love sound design, so I would love to make a game like that next quarter where you can load it up with one sound set and load it up.
yeah, that'd be really interesting to get a sense of how does sound affect that. That'd be really cool. I saw a hand here, 1 then 2.
In Ultra Kill, one of the neat sound design tricks that game does is that certain impacts that are supposed to be really impactful, the game will just for a split seconds like mute or deafen all the other sound effects, which makes even just like really simple sound effects that wouldn't be super impactful on their own sound way more impactful because the game's actually specifically calling out like that just happened.
Yeah. Yeah. In warlike games, if something explodes near you, if you actually hear the tinnitus going off after it deafens your hearing for a bit, it really adds to the realism of something just happened, something important happened around me.
I think it's funny though, because sometimes some sounds are intentionally supposed to be bad, or the designers intentionally made this way. And to give a certain point, and I bring up Cruelty Squad as a really good example of this game is atrocious to the eyes, and yet it is successful and fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
So it's not the be all and end all, but there has to be a reason behind the design for your sound. It can't just be, this was the first sound that I found that was close-ish to the sound that I want. It should be a decision that you make for a reason.
And what about background music?
Yeah.
Cause there's the, like. And I know I'm curious as to the, like, why did the music change?
Yeah, it can be very situational. There's nothing like fighting a really difficult final boss to the background of the Barney theme song.
If it's really like bass boosted and like slowed down, it'd be intimidating.
Yeah, yeah.
To bring up Oblivion with that, the most hilarious thing every single time was you hear the combat music, you sit there for like 30 seconds, and you see the slowest enemy possible coming out.
Dun-na, dun-na.
It's not even
It's a
that.
sloth.
It's like this big foreboding orchestral.
Don't mess with sloths, they can get you.
If they get you.
Yeah, well,
If they get you, they'll rip you
I
apart.
can't remember, it's either 3-toed or 2-toed sloths that are aggressive. I can't remember which one.
Do not know if stuff like that. So transitioning to and from combat situations is very useful for sound as well, for something like if your player character draws a weapon, that could be a great way of indicating danger. Something's happening around. Your character is getting ready for it. The person in control of this character, better be ready for it now as well. Or any kind of in an RPG where you have a separate battle screen, having some kind of celebratory music afterwards makes it sound like you accomplished something. And you should be proud of overcoming that battle. So you can also, of course, customize the sound and effects for a story situation. So if the story is sad, the music should portray the emotion of what's happening in the narrative around that event as well. How about how weapons feel and look? Visual feedback is very important as well. So if you're carrying around a heavy weapon, make it even feel heavier than it actually would be. Make your character really feel like they're hefting something large, and it makes it feel even more badass to fire and you can almost feel the recoil of that weapon when it fires because it is so intense, and it makes you feel all the more badass, even though the numerical balance is exactly the same, the projectile is exactly the same. The fact that you are this character capable of wielding this massive weapon that has massive recoil when it fires feels more badass. You can design for over-exaggerating a weapon's qualities. And that makes the player feel intelligent for selecting it. If I'm gonna fire a rocket launcher, make it feel like, whoa, I fired a rocket launcher. I'm gonna go, yeah, that's why I picked that weapon. If it's a pistol, maybe they feel like where I fired is really close to where that bullet ended up. That's why I picked that weapon. But over-exaggerate that with smaller circles and smaller crosshairs that make the user feel like, yeah, that's the reason I picked that weapon.
Yeah, well, back, no.
Yeah. So also what happens when a weapon impacts something? Maybe you have this big sledgehammer and you attack with it, if you leave a hole in the ground where it collided with the ground, you can really make it feel like I'm swinging this really heavy weapon. In fact, it affected the ground that it hit so much. You can also use particle effects to great use here. So if you fire something and it hits something metallic, create the sparks that shows, whoa, that was an interesting physical reaction to this projectile hitting this surface. Yeah.
With Helldivers too, they had an issue with this a little bit. They have like you can call an ordnance from like your ship that's up in the sky. And one of them was like this bomb, it was like a 500-kilogram bomb or whatever. And
Yeah.
like visually, it's pretty magnificent when it goes off. Like it's very fun to call in. But the like the impact zone where it like actually did damage did not match up with like the visuals.
Yeah.
And so people just were kind of like, like it looks really cool and I want to use it. But it's just not that great. And so in one of the updates, they upped it so that the impact zone matches the visuals. And now everybody loves it because it just really feels like you're causing carnage.
Going from 1/1000th degree burns to 1000th degree burns.
It feels good.
Well, that would be more napalm, but. Another thing that Helldivers 2 does that I think is really cool is that in that game, like. You effectively have two crosshairs. You have the crosshair that's stuck to the center of your screen. But as your character moves, their weapon will like sway and stuff.
Yeah,
And so you have a second crosshair that's actually where your weapon's pointing and that kind of moves around the screen.
sure.
And for the heavier weapons, they actually made it so like the movement of that second crosshair like changes. So when you're like lugging around a heavy cannon, it'll like sway back and forth like pretty slowly and it feels really hefty. And when you're like
Yeah.
carrying around a pistol, it just kind of like zips around but also snaps up really quickly. So
Right.
it's a really neat way for them to like actually give each weapon a unique feeling.
Yeah, that sounds like a great example of this. Yeah. So visual effects for things like this should play quickly. Any kind of immediate feedback is good. It shouldn't be a long lasting particle effect. Make sure that bang, it's over. Something that really shows that something quickly impacted. Also, what does the impact leave behind? Is there some kind of effect on the world around you from the fact that that weapon impacted that surface? How long does that stay around? Does it stay around forever? Does it stay around until you leave the zone? Does it go back to normal after 5 seconds? We've all played those kinds of games, but there are, of course, different performance indicators that can start to utilize too much memory to keep track of how is the terrain changed because of all of the actions. Also differentiating a hit from a miss, making it really feel good to hit with a weapon as opposed to miss with a weapon, make that hit feel different. So yeah, design something that makes the hit feel good. Of course, there are also you have to worry about the associated server calculations for any kind of real-time server-based game. So there can be client-side calculations so you're not waiting for the server to respond with what happened. Have some client-side calculations so that the user can feel that immediate benefit and then catch up with the server and maybe change some things. But it will feel crisp if a lot of that is handled on the client side.
Well, for things like explosions and particle effects, you don't necessarily need to like synchronize their pulse state. You can just sort of let all the clients know that X effect is playing here, and then all the clients do it. And if there's a little bit of desync, that's probably not going to matter too much.
Right. It becomes an issue when you don't feel like you were hit with something, but you die anyway. And that's just this kind of disagreement between the client and the server. So you want to minimize the effect of those actions. And the more you do on the client side, the more disagreement there's going to be between the client side and the server side. And so getting those to agree back together can actually be quite a bit of work. The server returns and says something very different from what the client says happened and what the player saw actually happened. So what do you do about that? Do you listen to the server? Do you somewhat listen to the server? Do you listen to the client so that the end user doesn't feel like they were cheaped out of something? There's a lot up in the air here, but it's something to really consider with your client server code. Clarity, pretty important. So I would even argue that combat is when clarity is most important. So we design a user interface in a game for the absolute tensest situations. You don't want your UI to be great in peaceful situations and then very cluttered in tense combat situations. You want to make sure that your UI is designed to give the information that the player needs when they're in those tense situations. So thinking again from the player's perspective, in those tensest situations, where is all of the relevant information that they would need? Is that something that they have to go hunt for? Is it something that distracts them from the action? Or is it something that is within their peripheral vision that they can quickly focus on, gather the information, and use it without distracting them from whatever they were focused on in the combat? The more a player has to go back and forth between thinking about things in the user interface and thinking about combat, the less natural it feels. So a player should easily be able to find things like, how much health do I have? How close are my allies to dying? Where are the enemies and how close are they to dying? Which enemy should I focus on based on their position and relative health values? How about locations? So health values and locations of all of those. What are your surroundings? Is there a cliff? Are there walls? Are you being sandwiched in between? What is your escape route? If you become in danger, where should you be moving? All of that information should be very easily accessible and plannable. If you're being attacked, who is it and where are they? That information should not take more than half a second for the player to figure out. If it does take more than half a second to figure out, then the player is either dead or they're wishing that the game relayed that information sooner, faster, with more clarity. From a designer's perspective, how do you design for clarity? So think about, what are your enemy movement and attack patterns? Are they more complicated than necessary? It is perfectly fine to have generic behavior in your AI as long as it still seems intelligent from the player's perspective. If you can make it simpler, then the player can have an easier time tracking them, as opposed to some more complicated action that doesn't actually lead to any in-game benefit. It doesn't add to the fun from the player's perspective. Take note of, when you're playtesting a game with people, note when your players are confused. Are they confused because they are overwhelmed with information? So I don't know whether I should move left or right. I'm being attacked by 2 different enemies at the same time. That's a strategic decision about who should I focus on. Whereas information clarity would be, I didn't even know I was being attacked before I died. So when a player expresses that confusion, try to identify the source of that confusion. If that is something related to your game's clarity, then you start to design the focus on increasing that clarity and reducing that confusion. Know when your player is not able to succeed at what they were trying to succeed at. If they die in the middle of a level, figure out what killed them. Did they have knowledge of what killed them? Did they know that was there? Did they know that they were in danger? If the answer was yes, you can ask them something like, do you feel like it was your failure that led to your death? Or do you feel like there was an aspect of the game that led to your death? That you needed more information to change what you were doing to be able to avoid the death? You can add something like a death recap. If the game is collecting information about what is the damage type that you took, what enemy was it? You can identify which enemy killed you, what was the damage type that killed you, from how far, with what weapon, with what element. Maybe in an RPG, you don't have good fire resistance. And so someone fired a flaming ball at you and it did 3 times the damage that it was balanced for because you didn't have the associated fire resistance. So if you see damage type fire, immediately next to that, put your character's fire resistance. And then the player goes, oh, that value is really low. Maybe I should focus on that. And now they know why, not only why they died, but what they can do about it. Take note of when they died or when they fail, how much information is on the screen? What did they have to balance? Do you have an overcluttered user interface, especially when a character is in danger? If you have lots of flashy effects happening simultaneously, does that distract the player from the danger that they are in? Is trying to look cool detracting from your player's ability to successfully play the game? And Path of Exile. Timing is super important in combat. So it's really a subcategory of clarity, but we can expand on that a good bit more. So players, did they have enough time to react to the danger that they were in? Once they knew that they were in danger, did they have time to dodge, move, fire back, block? Whatever it is that the player should be doing in response to that danger, did they have time between when they were aware of it and when they need to react to it? When is challenge appropriate for the player and for how long? If you have a game that is nonstop tension from start to end, the player is always in danger, always in danger, always in danger. Is that a good thing? Does that really build a narrative tension if you're always feeling that tension? So how long does the AI give the player before they throw the next challenge at them? I like to think of something like RimWorld as a good example of this, where you have different AI storytellers that have different approaches to how frequently and how much they challenge you. Do they throw really big challenges at you, but then give you large breaks between those challenges? Are there constant small challenges being thrown at you that are easier to overcome, but you don't have as much time to recover from them? Thinking about that in your design of both your AI as well as the kinds of challenges that you plan to throw at your player is important. Notice when your player starts to make a decision. When the player decides, I want to block this incoming attack, they don't want to wait for the game to recognize that, okay, you blocked. I'm going to start the shield raising process, and it takes a second for it to come into place to block a projectile. That's going to feel like the game doesn't respect the fact that they wanted to block the projectile. Nothing feels worse than having done the right thing, but just not quite soon enough for it to be effective. So again, crisp animations that react to the player is useful there. So don't wait for the game to react to something. One interesting point to note is that the actual game of StarCraft, the original StarCraft, is different between the Western published version and the South Korean published version. And that's because there are different target audiences for who's playing the game. The South Korean version is much more, since it's a sport, it's a national sport. Players expect to be able to very quickly move, assign things. And so everything, the timing of everything is balanced for a very different audience than the Western audience. And it actually is embedded in the game's code. So optimized differently to account for the associated demographic of who's going to be playing the game and what they're trying to get out of the game. Are your players taking a more casual approach to this, or are they taking a more hardcore and competitive approach to this? The different design in the timing of things based on who that audience is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be different versions of the game. It could just be different difficulties within the same game. We can talk about some pillars of combat. So what should you be thinking about and focusing on? You need to know what genre of game you're designing. So of course you should have this figured out before you're this deep into combat decisions anyway, but thinking about what mechanics are necessary because players have played games in this genre before. What do you need to be accounting for in your design just because players expect it to be there or expect to at least have some option in that realm? What mechanics differentiate your game from other games that they might have played in that genre? Making that a focus of your tutorial is especially important because very few players will be used to thinking about that mechanic. When you make changes to what players expect, what else needs to change in your game for that? So do you need more tutorial elements? Does this change the balance of every other system in the game? Can you take this design and apply that to some other elements in your game to reinforce or support that change, to make it easier for the player to learn how to play the game or to master the game. Time. Your battle systems can be real-time, turn-based, some combination of those, that's totally fine, but combat is approached from a design perspective very differently depending on how the battle system works. So if it's turn-based, it's likely that you're focusing more on strategy and letting the player take the time to figure out how to optimally react to the situation they are in. Whereas real-time, you need to take into account your players' reaction times. Do they know the value of blocking? Do they know the value of dodging? Do they know the value of counterattacking? The pacing of your combat is important to consider. So is the pacing supposed to be intense? Should the player feel like they're in danger all the time and it's real time, they're acting in response to the dangers that are around them? Or do they have the time to calculate, to methodically approach the combat? The feel of the combat. You can describe what you want your player to experience from the combat in English. And then design around that, what mechanics support that particular kind of emotional response that you want your player to get. So you could use words like scared or calculating or hopeful, and whatever you want to design for, there will be mechanics that better support that idea than other mechanics. If you want them to feel scared, then you don't want to put them in a turn-based situation where they can be calculating. You want them to have to react to something quickly and unexpectedly. Who is participating in your combat? We need the number and type. Are there other players? How many enemies are there? How strong are those enemies? If there are other players in your game, are you working with them or against them? Are you in teams? Are there some you're working with and some you're working against? Are there teammates of yours that are AI? Are there enemies that are AI? So just thinking about what is the mathematical representation of the combat that you are in. We have time for the rest of these. We're basically out of time. So we'll come back and talk about the remaining pillars of combat tomorrow. And I think my plan is for that to be the last real day of lecture. So we'll come back next. Perfect timing. We'll come back next week and get a lot of practice and experience with designing mechanics and balancing harmony and introducing some new mechanics into harmony. So I'll see you tomorrow for that. You can expect a study guide to be released tomorrow for an exam a week from tomorrow.